Professor Adedeji left some big shoes to be filled behind. He was one of the longest-serving executive secretaries of the ECA. In April last year, the UN Secretary General Antonio Guterres appointed the first woman to that position. Vera Songwe is a Cameroonian economist and banking executive who worked for the World Bank since 1998. She became Western and Central Africa's regional director for the IFC before she was appointed by the UN to her current position. We had a chat about poverty in Africa, the CFTA, and filling Professor Adedeji's shoes. Executive Secretary Vera Songwe, thank you for speaking with us on Diplomatic Channel. You're the first woman to occupy this position as Executive Secretary. What have been the challenge of putting a woman in this role? And would you say you're occupying at a very significant time when there's much attention given to gender parity and gender equality?
Look, I belong to the United Nations. I think that we're very proud at the United Nations to say that the Secretary General now has 50-50 parity, and in his appointment, I think that this is a very important step. It is also a message that goes out, I think, to all the young women. I think the gender parity drive has 2 or 3 components. One of them is, of course, to establish the fact that women can do this jobs just as well as the men can. But I think more importantly, it's for a demonstration effect. Is to be able to show all the young girls out there that they too can dream and that their dreams can become possible. So we are just sort of gateways, I can put it that way, to sort of the bigger things that I think the younger girls in countries like Niger and northern Nigeria and Morocco are aspiring to be. So that for me is the importance of this. Is not sort of that there's women out there, but it's really that the other young girls can do that. And then finally, and the third aspect is really, at the end of the day, women are 50% of every economy. And so if you allow them to participate in decision making and activities in the economy, then clearly you have a much more prosperous society. So again, I think that the whole quest for a better, safer, more sustainable world goes by having women standing at par with the men in making these decisions that keep the world safe and help us fulfill the SDGs.
Well, speaking of the economy, there's been a massive exodus of people from Africa into Europe, many of them going as economic migrants looking for greener pastures. What's the position of the ECA on these migrations?
Well, the ECA has been working, again, as you know, we are now in this year working on what we call the International Compact on Migration, which is a UN-led initiative that is trying to gather the whole world around sort of agreeing on what safe, and regular migration should look like, and to sort of put around some norms and a framework for which we can do migration. Migration has existed for as long as there has been man. I think on our own African continent, there was in the 13th and the 12th century huge migrations from West Africa up north. We had the Ottoman Empire around the 8th century come down to Africa. So I think the concept of migration, one, is not strange to the continent and it's not strange to the world. Economic migration has existed in Europe. We've had the Italians, huge waves of Italians go over to the United States for work. We've had huge waves of Northern Europeans, the Danes, the Swedish go over to Minnesota. If you go to the States, you see that. So I think where maybe there is a different kind of discussion is that the migration that is happening very recently, and I must say it's actually quite recent, is a migration that is a result of civil strife in some of the countries, some instability, and of course economic hardship. And I think this is where a lot of the work that we're doing at the ECA is to show what we can do to ensure that you can create more jobs on the continent, and that's where the Continental Free Trade Area agreements like the Single Air Transport Market, agreements like free movements of goods and of people on the continent becomes important, because while we have a lot of migration out of the continent, there is still a need for jobs on the continent in specialized areas. And again, on the continent, there's different kinds of migration, and I think it's very important when we talk about migration to distinguish sort of economic migration. We still have a lot of professors that leave Kenya and are deans in universities in the United States. We have doctors in the UK. Those migrants go on their own volition, and this is what we are saying, and that's what we're working on in the International Compact on Migration, Safe and Orderly Migration, is that if you're capable and if you can go and if your functions are needed, then you will migrate, and it's good because you're providing a service somewhere where there is none, and this is what economics does. It allows you to offer your services to the best bidder, and the best bidder may an economic, a social, or a political bidder that makes you feel safe, and so you go there. But I think what we see with the young kids that are crossing the ocean is desperation. And I think that is what is rejected by both the Africans and the Europeans, is we do not believe that it is a human right that people should voluntarily put their lives at such risk in search of economic prosperity, because we believe on the continent we can actually offer the kinds of jobs and the kinds of environments that should do that, with the right leadership, of course, and with the right economic policies in place.
Well, I think you do emphasize the same position the French President Emmanuel Macron did point out when he came to Nigeria just a few days ago at the CFTA. Not many countries are on board with it, but he says that Africa's economy will do better if more countries sign up to the CFTA. It will be much better for African countries to do that. How do you think, Africa's economy could move forward when you have countries like Nigeria not being on board with the CFTA?
I don't know whether it's proper to say that countries are not fully on board with it. I think what we're, when you come with such new changes, you need time for economies to domesticate it. You need time for the private sector to understand what this means. After all, the CFTA is about goods that are going to be produced by the private sector and sold by the private sector. So it really is about creating that space and that platform so the private sector across the continent feels comfortable about the fact that this is going to work. This also requires that we put rules and regulations around it that make it, competitive and level the playing field. And I think there is some more work that needs to be done in terms of explaining to the private sector and across the continent still, how we will treat issues of rules of origin. It's important that we ensure that for large economies like Nigeria, there is no sense that, one can import goods onto the continent that were produced outside the continent and then brought into Nigeria because of the CFTA. And essentially what you will get is dumping, which is, getting cheaper goods from out of the continent that will drive out Nigerian businesses. So I think this is a legitimate point, and I think we need to understand it. We need to be able to explain to the Nigerian private sector and the Nigerian businesses that these issues are being treated comfortably in the CFTA agreement. And I must say that the Minister of Trade of Nigeria has been a champion of the CFTA, and we have worked on these issues with him. There's issues of dispute settlement. How will we, resolve disputes when they arise? And I think these are issues that we have solutions for, but we need to maybe talk about them a little bit more, explain them a little bit more, so that countries like Nigeria, South Africa did not sign initially in Kigali, and they have now signed because we have done a little bit more work on education. They have done a little bit more work on consultation. I think the same is taking place in Nigeria, and we believe that Nigeria being at the center of continental trade since the 1st century cannot not be part of this process, and so I'm sure they will come on board.
So do you find it interesting that Nigeria, which is Africa's largest economy, still has much of its population living below the poverty line?
Poverty remains a struggle for the continent. We know that we have made a lot of progress on the poverty front. For the first time in this decade, we can say that we have more than 50% of the population above the poverty line. Of course, we still have a huge share of our population on the continent that is quite vulnerable to shocks like climate, vulnerable to shocks like diseases. And so I think that across the continent there is still a lot of work that we need to do in terms of ensuring that we lift more people out of poverty. This is why, work around CFTA and ensuring economic prosperity, making sure that we have the right policies in place becomes important, because if we create more jobs, and we have seen that if Africa trades with itself, Africa creates more jobs, Africa creates more value, Africa, creates more wealth that stays on the continent. So again, the fight against poverty is a fight that I think Africa can win. Africa needs to be dedicated to it. Africa needs leadership that puts in place the policies.
Finally, you were at the Memorial Symposium for the late Adebayo Adedeji, an astute diplomat, praised by his colleagues, at the symposium as an astounding scholar who's sound and good, and one who's occupied the position that you're occupying today. Do you feel any pressure filling in his shoes?
I think he's left an enormous legacy, as we have all heard today. The pressure that he felt at the time was of a continent that was coming out of, a difficult economic period where I think the voice of the continent was not as emboldened as it is today. And he had that challenge of taking a message that maybe was not sort of readily accepted by the rest of the world, to the rest of the world, in terms of sort of educating the world on Africa. I think the next challenge that we have as a continent, and which clearly ECA has to carry as well, it's not just educating the world about it, it's ensuring that Africa does implement some of the policies that he's left behind. And I think that is really a collective challenge for all of us. As we all know the problems. I think we have solutions ad nauseum. What we need to do on the continent today is implement, and I think that the big challenge for ECA is to help the continent think of new ideas and then ensure that they're implemented.
And that's the program this week. I'm glad you could join us. I am Amarachi Ubani. I'll see you next time.